joining us Palm Beach in Florida through Skype, professor at the Florida Atlantic University, Mr. John Renne. Welcome to our newscast, Mr. Renne. So, why do we hear that having two tropical storms or hurricanes moving at the same time, why is it a very rare meteorological event?
Yeah, well, it's just something that doesn't happen very frequently. My background is more in emergency preparedness and planning for disasters. So I can say that I've never seen a situation where we've had two hurricanes or tropical storms so close together. But it creates a very difficult situation for communities and local government and state government to prepare for the evacuation of the people along the coastal areas. I just returned back from spending about a month in New Orleans, and we are in a pandemic, which is creating a lot of challenges for being able to evacuate.
Yes, sir. So, we know that you're an expert on hurricane evacuation. So, at this point, how can we start the evacuation and the shelters within the framework of the COVID-19, and wearing masks and social distancing?
Yeah, the most important thing for people to do is to evacuate with friends and family so that they don't have to intermingle with strangers. That would be the most important thing, is to stay in your family unit or stay with a few people who you know well. And just like we are needing to do right now, during normal routine times during this pandemic, that doesn't necessarily change during the evacuation. But most people will evacuate themselves in their own cars. They will need to find shelter, most likely with friends or in hotels that are in a safe location, a distant way from the impacts of where the storm's going to hit. Now, if Hurricane Laura shifts a little bit further to the west and goes to Houston, it will create a lot more problems, because in Houston, and also similar to New Orleans, it doesn't look like Hurricane Laura is going to hit New Orleans. It may continue further west to Houston, and Houston has a very large population and a large percentage of people who don't have access to cars. They rely on buses and public transportation, or they can't drive because maybe they have disabilities or they're too old. So that could really be a very difficult situation if the hurricane drifts further to the west and threatens Houston.
Yes, sir. So we are talking about evacuation under the corona circumstances. Now, poor people and elderly people who also do not have sufficient financial capabilities would have to seek public refuges. What can we do in a public shelter in order to have social distancing? I mean, these people obviously cannot go to hotels. What should they do in the shelters?
That's a very good question, and it's a topic that I've been studying pretty intensely for the last 15 years since Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And unfortunately, this is a very unique situation to have sheltering in public shelters during a pandemic, because the two concepts are somewhat in opposition to one another. During a hurricane, you want to have as many people as possible fit into a shelter for safety until the storm passes, and then the people will go home. But during a pandemic, if you put up a lot of cots and have people sleep next to each other who one person may have COVID. It could spread very quickly to a lot of the other people in the shelter. And so there's a couple of things to remember. Number one is that more people die of flooding in the United States than any other natural disaster. Number two, it's important to evacuate a flood-prone area instead of the fear of being in a shelter or the fear of being in a location because of the fear of COVID. Most people do not die from COVID. Most people do survive. The survival rate is very, very high. So COVID should not be a reason why people would not evacuate. But I do know that shelters are taking precautions right now to reduce the amount of capacity, create more shelters with lower capacity, to have more socially distant sheltering, and to provide the PPE, the personal protection equipment, such as masks and sanitizer and other forms of ways to protect people from the coronavirus. So it's if the hurricane is coming at you, you should evacuate if you're in a flood-prone area. And if you can evacuate at a place with friends or family, that's the best thing that you could do.
Mr. John Renne, professor at the Florida Atlantic University, expert on hurricane evacuation. Thank you very much for joining us.